Good morning and welcome. My name is David Dirks. I am VP of Marketing at Hudson Valley Credit Union, and I'm your panel moderator today. We welcome some of our business members. We have over 7,000 plus business members that we service and provide financial services to in the Hudson Valley region. And we also welcome you business owners who are not currently members of the Hudson Valley Credit Union, at least not yet, but we hope you'll get a chance to take a look at us today. We are very much interested as a credit union in our regional community and the health and the thriving ability of our small business community in particular, which is the reason why we are undertaking, this is the third in a webinar series that we have committed to help small business owners not only survive in a COVID environment and a tough economic environment, but also to help them to thrive, to grow. And we're very optimistic about, those business owners that really are willing to take the time and invest in webinars like this, where I will introduce our panelists for this webinar in just a moment. Before we begin, I'd like to do some housekeeping. One of them is that first, if you have questions that come to mind during the webinar, you can ask them in the Q&A section, which you'll see on your screen. And then we'll address all questions at the end of the panel discussion. We'll leave, 15, 20 minutes, whatever we need to answer questions. The webinar itself is scheduled to go till about 1 p.m. plus or minus. If we finish a little earlier, no worries. We'll just give you back a few minutes. And then we'll have the chat feature turned on as well, so that if you want to network or make comments to any of the others that are attending this webinar, you can feel free to do so as well. That chat will be monitored by one of our team members. We will also be providing all who registered. So we find sometimes that people register, but they're not able to always attend. We send everybody that registers. We have well over 50 people I think we have 54 people that have registered for this webinar, and we send them the links after so they can take a look at it. And very often we get a lot of folks, because we can monitor those links. We get a lot of folks who look at these. Again, this content will also be posted eventually on our Hudson Valley Credit Union YouTube channel. So it will be available to the general public as well. So with that said, and that housekeeping done, let me now introduce you to our panelists and to our webinar. Okay, there we go. You can start to see us now. Today's webinar, we've had two other webinars that we started with this summer. The first was on marketing. The second was on sales strategy and tactics. And this one is on data analytics in context to small business owners who have access to data. And my preference, my baseline here is that every business, large or small, generates data. Could be website data, customer data, financial data, pricing data. You have data. The challenges for small business owners versus larger companies have resources. They can hire specialists to analyze and organize that data and clean that data and make that data usable. And it's not always possible for small business owners who are, jack of all trades, trying to do everything. The question is, how can a small business owner leverage the data that they do have? Where do they find it? What do they do with it? What do they try to solve with it? And so our attempt here in this webinar is to acutely focus on the small business owner who we know has less resources and less time, and how do they in fact leverage for their competitive advantage the data that they have, okay, to solve problems, to get better insights, to grow their business. And so our panel today, I'm very happy to say, I'm very glad that they could share some of their time with us. I'll start off with Dr. Chi-Yang Tsai, who is a professor of data analytics at the State University at New Paltz. I've known him for a number of years now. He's a professor of business analytics there. He received his PhD in operations research from the Stern School of Business in New York. His research interests include supply chain logistics, linear and nonlinear optimization. I probably could learn about that. And machine learning as well. Dr. Sai has a wide range of consulting experience with startups in Mid-Hudson regional businesses in particular, and also Fortune 500 companies. Before entering academia, he worked as a production controller and as a special assistant to the CEO of a multinational manufacturer. Welcome, Dr. Sai. We appreciate that. We also have with us here, highly esteemed, and a gentleman I've known for a long time, and who people I run into still say today, yes, I had a course with him. Dr. Theodore, you are a doctor, right? Are you a doctor?
No.
No, we got the master's, I got it. Ted Clark is a retired professor from the State University of New Paltz as well. He's a well-known marketer. He has taught marketing at SUNY for about 30 years before he decided to retire. And I don't think he's really retired yet. So we can question that. He holds several degrees in management and marketing. And in 2010, Professor Clark launched his own consulting company called Ted Clark and Associates, which specializes in marketing research studies for healthcare and financial services organizations. And Ted, we're glad to have you here as well.
Thank you.
And of course, from our very own ranks, we're very proud and happy to have a gentleman who joined me 3 years ago when I came to Hudson Valley Credit Union. He is Troy Diwali. He is our VP of Business Intelligence, which is a whole new area, a growth area in a lot of companies. You see a lot of investment in business intelligence. He'll talk to you a little bit more about that. But he's our VP of Business Intelligence here at Hudson Valley. His work focuses on data warehouse architecture, analytical reporting, and member profitability. Troy has led initiatives here for internal process automation, creation of a data governance council, reporting and dashboard development, as well as developing multiple machine learning projects, which I can tell you he has his hands full. I don't think he gets much sleep. Before coming to Mid-Hudson Valley, Troy was AVP of Business Intelligence at Mid-Florida Credit Union, down where you are, Ted. And while at Mid-Florida, Troy managed the data warehouse, employee incentive programs, and he implemented self-service business intelligence, or BI. He received his MBA from the University of Tampa with a concentration on management information systems. Welcome, Troy.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead here. We have a starting group of questions we're going to ask each panelist. What I'm going to do is start with the question, and then we're just going to do a round robin with each panelist. So let me start with the first one. The concept of leveraging big data, which we hear a lot about. There's so much written in the last few years. It's almost overwhelming how much is out there. And of course, whole consultancies have grown up around this. There's a whole industry around big data today. But big data, we hear a lot about for competitive advantage. And it's usually positioned as something only large businesses, as we said before, which have the ample resources can do. My question to each of you is, why should, first of all, a small business owner consider leveraging the data they have for competitive advantage? So let me start with you, Dr. Sai. Why don't you kick it off?
Okay, I think the important thing is not only for competitive advantage, but also for survival, because competition is getting fierce ever more than before. So efficiency is very important, that you have to keep improving your process and reach out to your customer, watching the trend of the market. But another thing I think is very important is that in the past, small business always work in a small niche market where big competitors, because of their high overhead, they are not interested in the small market. But now, because of this business analytics, they have point of sales data, they know the customers better. So, and they already invest millions of dollars on their IT infrastructure. So for them to going into a smaller niche market, now the additional cost is very minimum, it's very marginal. So in a sense, just think about in the region, HealthQuest, or they now call what Nuance or other names. I mean, they run the billing systems for their own system, but then they started acquiring small independent doctor's office, because for them, processing additional payment for those newly joined offices just doesn't cost much, right? They already have the infrastructure there. So just to think about that, I mean, not only you have to improve your own competitive advantages, but also you have to fend off the competition coming from outside. So the idea is trying to know your customers even better, because now the big companies have those resources now to chip into your market. So I think that's becoming ever more important.
Okay, good. Thank you, Dr. Sai. Ted, how would you like to answer that?
It's kind of interesting what Dr. Sai said, and but at a very basic level, what I think small businesses don't recognize is the amount of information they already have. I mean, the idea of using big data is certainly key because of the vast amount of information. But with a lot of small businesses, they seem to get overwhelmed with the idea of looking at big data. So as a small business, surprisingly, one of the things that small businesses have is they have an abundance of information that's already available within the organization. I mean, there's just a lot of organic data that's gathered as a result of doing business. I mean, for example, you don't have to today with small businesses, you don't have to buy the information, because often you can make the information that's available on the basis of your operation. And certainly the idea of using, your own information first before you even look at big data is probably driven by the quality of information that you've gathered. Because one of the problems between making and buying information is the fact that if you buy information, you're not familiar with the actual process for gathering that data. Whereas the operation that you run, gives you some pretty high quality information. So, and let's face it, unknowingly, businesses often gather a tremendous amount of information on geographics, demographics, consumer behavior. It's just an enormous amount of data that's available internally. And that's got to be the starting point before you even move on to the idea of big data.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Troy?
I'm just going to agree a lot with Dr. Sai and Mr. Clark here. But really, as a small business, in many ways, what's going to set you apart when compared to a lot of the large businesses is that you have a more personal relationship with your customers. And so a lot of times, because that personal relationship you have with them, you have data points on that you're already using that you may not be aware of, right? You know what they like, you know the seasonality of the requests coming in from those members or the products they like. So you're kind of leveraging it that way. When you're looking at big data on this, you're taking that amount of data and you're aggregating it up to where you're reaching out to more customers, but you're still maintaining that very personal relationship with them so that you're not losing that to where your customers now feel like they're a number, right? So a lot of large companies leverage big data in order to have that type of personal relationship with members, to create that more personal relationship. For you have that personal relationship. You want to leverage the big data so you can maintain it as you continue to grow as a business.
Okay, very good. And I'm going to take a moment here to take a quick break, because what I want to be able to do, I want to poll our listeners right now, those of you that are on the call. We're going to bring up the first poll. This will give us an idea, sort of a little bit about how you're keeping records now, all the data that you have all out there. The first poll is, if you could answer, please, is how does your organization keep the records generated from sales and purchases? And if you could take a moment there, and then we'll take a look at the basically how the poll came out on this first poll. Okay. Just takes a second or two. And so here we are. So there you have it. Excel, not a surprise there. More than 50% of you. QuickBooks, a few of you, and then a few have some fairly sophisticated tools under MySQL or an SQL server. So interesting enough. Okay. Very good. Let's ask our next polling question. We have two more to go. Where does the data reside? So tell us where you actually store your data. So if you could go ahead, those of you on the call, and provide us your feedback. Okay, and there we go. So most of you, 43% said on a single computer, not a surprise, it's pretty common for small business owners. A few of you through an internal network, some of you via a cloud service. So that's very good. Okay, thank you. And we have one more poll. And thank you, Dr. Sai, for providing these poll questions.
Welcome.
Who is in charge of your IT needs? So go ahead and just give us your point of view there. Okay. And there we have it. So about half of you do not have a designated person yet, which is not a surprise. Again, small businesses tend to have less resources. A few of you, one of you at least has an IT team, and then some of you actually outsource some of your IT needs, which is very common today to find economically priced outsourcing for that as well. Okay, good. All right, thank you for those of you who participated in the polling. That does give us a little kind of a setting. So I want to go back to, and I had someone comment, which I think is pretty important. Ted, you said that, you know what, all businesses have a lot of data. You know, some of it's on their website, some of it's in their, you know, their QuickBooks, some of it's over here in their personnel ledger, some of it's on their customer service. If they have a CRM system, which they manage their customer information on, it's all over the place. And it's overwhelming. You know, it's like big data to small business is just as complicated as it is for big business. The question I saw, so I noticed someone here said, we don't really use any method to gather or store data. And I think that's part of the issue. What would you recommend? And this is a panelist question. How does a business owner, where should they start? What should they be thinking about? Should it be inventorying it, putting it together? How do they bring it together so it actually makes sense? And Troy, we're going to start with you.
So my take on that is really a lot of times when you're thinking about your data, you need to ask yourself, what's the business question you want to answer first, right? So because to your point, if you approach all of the data thinking, you know, I'm going to try and organize everything I have, you're just going to end up getting lost in it. And so you need to kind of apply an organizational structure. As a small business, you're going to want to grow that organically. So taking small steps will give you a lot of additional reward, get you used to the process of identifying data to answer specific questions so that you can then organize it and answer the questions and find additional questions to look for. A good place to start if you have a web page and you're using Google Analytics is Google Analytics. You know, who is visiting my website? How often are they visiting my website? How are my campaigns working with my website? Those are things you can look at. If you're not running a website, you have your financials. You can look at your financials, your sales records, and kind of ask questions there, like, are people ordering more? Are they ordering less? Do we have a lot of recurring customers? Ask those questions and then go look for your data that supports those questions. As you keep asking questions, you'll begin to fully build out your data structure on that, and you'll get there. It's not they didn't build Rome overnight. So you just kind of have to take that outlook and be a little patient with it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Mr. Clark?
Well, what Troy said makes a lot of sense. And I think that the process of data analysis has to be driven by your end goal. There's no doubt about it. And so that the availability of data sometimes is a bit of a challenge for small businesses. But as Troy had suggested, using something like Google Analytics, which essentially is not necessarily a very complex program, allows you to gather a lot of information from a website. So the question is, you're right, what's the goal? What's the intention of the organization? What has a priority in terms of information? And I think therefore that, using or starting with something like Google Analytics probably would make more sense instead of necessarily trying to look to compile a lot of information. However, having said that, There's no reason that a small organization can't also develop a dashboard for information where you might have 3 or 4 different sources feeding into that dashboard in order to give you an overview of what the organization is doing in terms of variety of data points, as Troy suggested.
Okay, very good. Thank you, sir. Dr. Sai?
Okay, and again, I agree with what Troy and Ted said. And also a lot of time, in one sense, I was thinking about when you just started thinking about business analytics, you probably don't have as many like concrete questions to ask yet, but you do have in every organization. I mean, I know that most of you are from a smaller sized businesses, so, but you all have accounting system. So I think 2 directions of data you must already have. One is transactional data. When you sell something to your customers, what you record is who made the purchase, how much, what products they purchase. So these are the building foundations for your future question. You can find the trend when certain types of products are more popular, seasonality, and so on. So on one hand is transactional. The other is your process data. How do you fulfill your order? When do you place an order? And that's what David mentioned about inventory data and who processed this order. How much time does it take to fulfill the orders? So, and these are the 2 basic sides. You have a transactional data, you have process data, and then a lot of you use, for example, QuickBooks. I mean, it becomes more and more powerful. You have the customer data there, you have sales transaction data there. And now I haven't taken a look I've taken a look in recent years, but it must have been providing more and more reports. And so you grow with the software company. I mean, if you use that over time, as long as you enter the data, I bet that in the future, the software company will be able to provide more service for you. Okay, that's my point.
Okay, good. So let's go back to the data itself. So wherever the data resides, I think we can all agree that it's garbage in, garbage out. So how does a small business owner deal with the quality of the data that they have, and what should they be asking themselves as they're kind of looking at their various data sets or wherever their data might be housed around their business? What should they be thinking about in terms of, the reliability of the data that they have? Dr. Sai, we're actually going to rotate back to you.
Okay. Again, as David said, garbage in, garbage out. You have to create the mindset that thinking about in the future, you are going to utilize, you're going to analyze the data, including this piece of data you just entered. So make sure that when you enter, make it complete. For example, a lot of time when you type in something with the extra space at the end, when you query the system, it means different things. A male with a space at the end, female with a space is different from male or female. So that's important. So when you design that, a lot of times the software design usually use a pull down menu instead of ask you to enter. So because it's more likely you make mistakes. So the integrity is a habit that one is you make sure that when you enter data, you want to have a complete information. You don't want somebody missing a small piece, the city or zip code. It has to be consistent. And then you check the accuracies, as I said, you don't miss a space. And then when another thing is when you make update, try to keep one place when you update the customer data. So if you have a database more in the traditional design, when you update, usually one place. Okay? But if you use a spreadsheet, you got to be more careful because you have a lot of places carry the same customer's address. When you update that, you have to make sure that to maintain the integrity, you have to make sure that every place is updated, especially a lot of small companies that use different software packages for different purposes. And you have a marketing software, your accounting software, and a lot of time you have to access the same information. But if they are different on different systems, that create trouble in the future. So I would say that at least for the addition or update, you have a focal point, a central point where you update only one place and try to propagate all the changes to all other systems.
Okay, Mr. Clark, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I do. When it comes to data, the quality of data, one of the ways to ensure that it is quality data is to use triangulation. I'm a big fan, for example, if I gather any information, what I want to do is I want to look for a second or third source to support the fact that, you know what, there's a cohesion here. For example, if I wanted to look at demographics for my company, what I'm going to do is after I gather demographic information, I'm going to go out to the Census Bureau and take a look at what the Census Bureau has compiled in terms of that particular region, just so that I have a source that I feel comfortable with. Because if I've managed to gather demographics that are supposed to represent a particular region or a market or a group, that I can look at the census data and receive confirmation that they in fact have the same frames for both geographics and demographics, then I'm going to feel a heck of a lot more comfortable with this. I know, and there's other social networks that, you know, you can gather information and triangulate with, you know, as well as mining big data, because we did talk about big data before, and certainly mining it to get information about a particular area that you're interested in and receive confirmation, I think is what's key.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Troy, you want to cap that off?
Yeah, I agree with both gentlemen. You do need to validate your data. I would also add, though, that don't be scared that you don't have all of the data you need and that you won't be able to generate that data going forwards. We had an initiative here for a machine learning program where we did not have good data in order to support the program. So part of that was we were asking questions of like, okay, well, how do we do this? And they're like, okay, we don't have what we need in order to make these assumptions or answer this question. So then we went into the process of like, how do we get that data? And then we went about implementing that process so that going forward, we would have the data to drive that project. So don't be scared thinking that you need everything set up perfectly now. You are not going to be able to think of every possible business question that you might have in the future when looking at your data. But to Dr. Tsai's point, I absolutely do not like free text form because I can't tell you how many times I've seen Poughkeepsie spelled, and that drives me crazy. So if you have the ability to limit people to specific choices, from a statistical standpoint, when you're looking at aggregating data and drawing inferences off of it, that's a lot better when you have set variables versus people just being able to type in whatever they want. So.
Okay, good. And so, of course, you know, organizing, we've been talking about organizing data. So, you know, where is your data? Start to organize it, start to look at the quality of that data. And then the common question is, you know, these data, all the data resides in a small business in different areas. We have the luxury oftentimes in big business to create these data warehouses, data lakes, and all this stuff out there that's expensive. I just want to go back to the point of, so if my data is in this, you know, different parts of my company, my business, how do I bring it all together? How do I, because I know I might need a data set from over here to actually help me solve something with this data set over here. You know, how do they bring that together? How do you ease their pain? Let's start with Ted. You want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, no, I'm going to give that to Dr. Tsai, who I know is better tuned to answering that question.
Very good.
Okay. I think this is it will probably a long process, especially we initially kept all the data on papers, Rolodex, and now you're moving to a data, a flat file like Excel. So my thought is that you started creating structure. Okay, so more like following the database design structure, and then try to update from just slowly moving something. For example, you have a customer data at one location. And if you have two different systems requiring access to that customer data, just pull the data from the same place and you update from the same place. So you must start creating some structure. But as I said, like for small business, this probably takes time. But there are a lot of this existing software like QuickBooks. I mean, you have a customer table there. So that if you are using those software, I always say that you grow with the software company. I mean, when they provide more functionalities, you grow with them. Now you have more tools, and think about Excel, in the past, you have to buy extra add-ins to solve a lot of problems. Now they come with that. Of course, they've shut down those small businesses used to run the add-ins. But that is a benefit to the users that you are able to gain more and more functionalities over time. So start with whatever you are using now. If you use QuickBooks and they already have a small database built in, if you're using Excel, try to organize a separate place where you update the information at one location.
Okay. Troy, you have any last minute or anything on that as well?
No, I agree with Dr. Sai. Use what you know. Really leverage that. If you're very comfortable with Excel, Excel can actually do a lot of things for you. And so just grow with what you're comfortable. The last thing you want as a small business is to be held hostage by IT infrastructure for something that you're not necessarily sure of how it works, and you paid a lot of money for it. So you want to make sure you get your money's worth out of it. I would strongly recommend against that. You don't need to be an early adopter for a lot of this stuff. You can implement a little bit later and kind of enjoy the benefits of everybody else stumbling ahead and making all the mistakes with that software. And then just, as Dr. Sai said, just growing with it as it progresses.
So it sounds to me, though, that it's really important as you look at software opportunities, whether it's CRM for customer management, and that's whether that's in your financials piece, and the other, there's your logistics info, or maybe it's in inventory systems. It sounds to me as if it's pretty darn important to make sure that while it's easy to use on the front end, that it really provides usable data for you. So I don't know if people really pay attention to the outputs, like the reporting functionality in these software packages. Anyone?
So to your point, a lot of IT professionals will be very specific and focused on the outputs that you can get out of those systems. If you're using things like Google Analytics, QuickBooks, if you're using Salesforce, since Salesforce purchased Tableau, I'm sure their reporting software has gotten a lot better. You can, if you're comfortable with the information, if you can take some online training classes, maybe look through some YouTube videos on how to do some of the reporting through those, you can kind of get a better idea. But really, whenever I'm building a report or a dashboard, I'm always asking myself, what is the story that I'm telling on this, right? Because I don't want to just give someone a whole bunch of numbers to where they're just looking at it like, well, what is this telling me? Oh, well, it's telling you these numbers. Like, that's the worst thing you can have. So if you have a system and it's QuickBooks, it's going to give you some basic export functionality. I wouldn't be as worried about that unless you were taking the stuff out of QuickBooks and then throwing it into Excel and using Excel as like your central repository of data in order to build other reports.
Okay.
So that's stuff you would struggle with, but generally, just as you're looking at these exports of reports and stuff, really just keep in mind, what's the question I'm trying to answer? What's the story I'm trying to tell with this data?
Okay, we'll come back to that storytelling in a minute too. That's an important point. Thank you. And let's focus on Excel. We saw that at least 50% of our webinar attendees today are using Excel in one form or the other, whether they're building pivot tables. Thank God for the pivot table, right? And it is far more powerful than it was, 5 or even 10, 15 years ago in terms of the features and the functionality that comes with it. Really powerful. And I've seen a lot of big companies still using Excel, amazingly, billion-dollar companies still running the whole operation on Excel, which is a little scary to me. But for the small business owner, my question is really this. I mean, everybody has a varying amount of skill when it comes to Excel. And so maybe if you can just say, how far does a small business owner need to get? Because that is a key tool. It's commonly available. It's not expensive. It's a lot of things can import to it. What are your points of view on how far or what kind of an investment a small business owner needs to make in learning Excel skills? And Dr. Sai, we'll start with you.
I guess, again, as Troy said, you learn as you need it. That's the best way to learn it when you really need that. I would say pivot table is probably the one thing you would need it right away. Give you a summary like sales by region, by months and so on. So that has just a very high level functionality that you can begin with. And there are a lot of, for example, small business, like for example, this mortgage payment function. If you have a mortgage, you have car loans, and that's always good to track. It's not just a monthly payment, because I mean you want, it's a motivation. Right? You see how much your capital the capital goes down when you pay your monthly payment. It's an incentive. And also calculation. Just give you an example. What I did when I have a home mortgage, house mortgage, I put a monthly payment table on Excel spreadsheet. And it's as a motivation. Sometimes I send extra money to pay down the principals, right? So, but a few times, this is not Hudson Valley Credit Union, another bank I used in the past. They took that payment as if I'm paying my next payment early instead of taking it down of my principal. That makes a difference. And because you have the formulas, again, there are two things that helps. One is to motivate you to save to pay some principal down earlier. Second, if they made a mistake, you know that what's the difference they made, you can call them to check that. And going back to what David also said about this small company becomes, we have a lot of students going to work for big companies. They are still, the first job is spending hours of time on Excel. And I did that, a consulting job for very big companies. They have the marketing budget of $200 million a year. Before they hire me, they use Excel with like 10 page, like probably 20 sheets on the Excel model. So it's doable. Of course, it becomes too complicated. That's why they want to move up to another level. But it's a lot of functions there. As you learn more, starts from small things. I mean, there are a lot of functions. They have the financial function. I think you probably use the most. You go to the formula tab and you click. It's by category. So look at the financial function, whatever useful to you, and start learning from those. And they also go to YouTube video. There are always people teaching how to use those functions.
Okay. Other panelists?
You know, what I was thinking about, there's two things that I thought were particularly important. You know, visualization of information is key to understanding things relatively quickly. Because if you can visualize the data, you know, it tells a story, as Troy suggested, at a basic level. And so using Excel, it allows you to do that because you can extract the information from Excel, put it in a graph or chart, and you can see, especially what's important are trends. And so I think using Excel for a small business is really key, given the fact that sometimes the Excel spreadsheet isn't that extensive or complicated. So visualization will be important in terms of that. The big thing is, to me, I can give a quick example. Using an Excel spreadsheet for a membership roster, for example, if you're a nonprofit or a small business, would allow you to gather information, and a lot of information, just as we were talking about before, can you gather a sufficient amount of information as a small business into one area? And actually the Excel spreadsheet will allow you to do that. So for those two reasons, I think that the continued use of it turns out to be very valuable for a small business.
Okay. Troy, any comments on that?
As long as you don't hold this against me in future meetings, but Excel is an incredibly powerful tool. And for a lot of small businesses, if you're knowledgeable with Excel, you can do things in there that you would be pretty amazed with. Like, you can build forecasting models with regression. You can do a lot of really amazing things inside of Excel if you have the knowledge for it. To Dr. Tsai's point, when you start to ask yourself questions on the data and then you're trying to dive into your financial data in Excel to figure that out, that's when you're going to learn about other functions or functionality. You're going to do a lot of Google searches, asking those types of questions. And I, to this day, still do Google searches. A lot of it is, just I can't quite remember how the formula works in Excel. I know that it's possible and I know how to do it, but I can't remember what the syntax is. So don't think that going to online tutorials or using sources like Google to try and find answers for how to do something in Excel is a knock against you. Everybody still does it. They just may do it where you don't see them so that you think they're a genius. So.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I also want to point out too that, and I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this, you can run in some organizations, I've seen it in my past, where they become Excel chop shops. So what happens is they take data from one Excel sheet and they chop it into the next Excel sheet. And then next thing you know, they've got all this data flowing through. And if something is off, I'm not going to be able to tell you what that is, but I've seen it where, is there a chance where when you do a lot of chopping with data in Excel that you can run into problems? You can end up coming out with outputs, data outputs or insights that might not be accurate? You guys know what I mean, right?
Yeah, anytime you have, and that's the one bad part about Excel, because everybody's made what I call fat finger mistakes, right? You meant to type in 20, you type in 200. You meant to type in whatever. That falls down to your data quality. When you have people that are copying and pasting stuff from one report, one Excel spreadsheet to another, the problem you have with that is you don't necessarily have a good pathway to identify where those numbers are coming from, right? So your transparency on that data quality, on what information is being provided to you, that starts to drop down. That speaks to like having one central source of data, whether it's you keep everything on a server, or if you just have one massive QuickBook or Excel spreadsheet, making sure that you can follow your data back to its source for validation, like Ted spoke to, using a third party for validating Census Bureau information. Being able to trace that back helps you eliminate what you may run into where someone even potentially takes an outdated Excel spreadsheet that hasn't been updated with customer information and then uses it with new information. And then that causes you to be like, oh, well, we need to market to these members because we haven't been marketing to them enough. And yet you just had wrong data being applied to it.
Yep. Okay, very good. Anyone else?
I think that one is, instead of copy and paste, if you just link to another file, so you are getting the data from the source file, you update from there instead of having multiple copies. That's the one point we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've seen a lot of chopping. I call it Excel chop shop. So I want to go back to something we touched on a little bit earlier in this discussion, and that is, you really should understand, as I think all of you said, one rule is you should understand what you're trying to solve for with the data you have. So if we all agree that that's true, we want to solve for profitability with, which products seem to be the better selling products, which ones tend to be the dogs or whatever. Oftentimes, the question I think business owners have is, so, okay, if I've identified what X I want to solve for, how do I know I have all the data, the right data available to me to solve for it? Any comments, questions? I don't know. Troy, do you want to start?
I'll use an example. So when I worked for a technology company down in Florida prior to the credit union, one of the questions they had was they sent a lot of people overseas to multiple conferences. It was a cellular company. And they would host, attendees for dinners and stuff. And the whole thing about it was to, get contracts from these attendees in order to have income that would offset the amount of money we were expending. So the question was like, how are we guaranteeing our return on our attendance to these different conferences? Can we identify which conferences we're not getting as much of a return out of? And then the question is, well, is it that conference or is it the person we sent to that conference, right? So there was two questions. What's our return on the people we're sending? And then what's the return overall on the conferences? So to do that, I went through financial records, right? So I started grabbing all of our transactional for when people would submit receipts for what they had attended the conference for. And then we linked that to the sales data for when we actually did close on some type of cross-sell or new product or new customer that was linked to that conference that we had attended. So you may not know why, right? So to your point, you know what you want to answer for X, but it's only when you're thinking about X and you start to dive into your data, and you start to identify what you need in order to answer that you'll come to why. So it's very much a research type of endeavor. Your curiosity, your critical thinking skills, those are going to be your two greatest assets when it comes to data analysis. Not being afraid to ask why or how, and really taking a look at your financials, what you're getting, maybe what data you're not currently getting, but if you have it, then you can answer that question. Those are the things that are going to drive you to be able to get the answers you need.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel want to take a stab at that?
I think you are going to always looking for missing stuff. You always say, okay, I should have that, I should have that. But the point is that you are not going to have whatever you needed all the time. So the idea is that one is, of course, you can infer things that you miss. But another thing is that even you have all the data you ever wanted, you can never build a model that behaves exactly like the real world. So thinking about having something, a data, is helping you make the decision, not the decision itself. Just whatever data you can grab and start with something you are familiar with, that you have the common sense from your years of experience. When the answer doesn't make sense, then you know there's something missing, and you started adding that or make the model more complicated. And so it's just thinking about data as something that help you make the decision, like a GPS, but you don't follow the GPS like blindly. At least you should still know that in the morning, if you're driving, you saw the sun, then that's east, right? So that those your common sense are always staying with you, and you're using those additional information to help you, because if the information change, if you don't update your GPS data, you're not going to get a perfect guidance from the system, or you lost the satellite connection. So these are things just always thinking about. You're always making decision under imperfect information, and whatever you can get would help you, but don't just trust that blindly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's the balance between intuition, experience, and then the data insights that you get. You have to kind of make sure you have sort of a balance there. And we're not getting into machine learning or AI at this point, which is a whole nother workshop at another time. We'll leave that. Mr. Clark, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, there was another thought I had. One of the challenges in analyzing data is that, you would love to have the analysis come out in a way that favors a decision you may have already decided on, which is kind of a scary situation, because we run into that repeatedly. I want to do this, and I'm going to gather information, and I'm going to hope that that data validates whatever decision I've already made. One of the things I always try to do with clients is to, in an attempt to ask, okay, if the data does point you in this direction, as Chiang says, does it really make sense? So let's look at the possibilities of outcomes on your data analysis. In other words, there are several, let's say there are two, now let's make it simple. Let's say there are two outcomes that are possible on the basis of your analysis of the data. And so once you walk yourself through that process, you have to ask yourself, okay, what would I do if the outcome suggests that I go in that particular direction? But once again, if it doesn't make sense, as Jan says, you've got to ask yourself, okay, what's wrong? Let me back up on this.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because doesn't that bring the small business owner back to sometimes the analysis that you do might actually point to, for you to do more digging and more research. It's not a one-stop process, right? You might actually have to ask, as Troy said, more questions might come out of this.
Yes.
So it's an iterative process.
Agreed.
Okay. So good points on that. Let me switch over to the common pitfalls that you've seen. Most all of you have had obviously exposure to different businesses over the years in your careers. And you've seen organizations really execute really well on their analytics in terms of gaining insights that they can apply to their businesses in a way that helps them either to solve problems or competitive differentiation one way or the other. Maybe if you could think back to the common pitfalls that you think the listeners today, the people that are listening, would want to make sure that they avoid. Some we might have covered, some that we didn't. And if you can kind of we'll just do a round robin on that. And I'll start with you, Mr. Clark.
I guess I'll go back to something we said before. The need to validate the accuracy of the information is probably key to me, and finding alternative sources of that information, that block of information that I'm looking for, is probably the biggest pitfall, because you just don't know how accurate that information is. And, making decisions clearly on inaccurate information is a true challenge. And so I would adhere to the idea that you need to validate the information, and that's the major pitfall that I think small businesses face.
Okay, Dr. Sai, any?
I think one myth is that people tend to think that this machine learning, big data can solve everything, and which is not true. It is important that if you have an organization, you have to change the organizational culture. If you think about in the earlier days when we were focusing on total quality management or just in time, it's not just we copy a system and make it work tomorrow. It's a slow process. You have to change your culture. So if you are just more like individual owners, it means change your mindset. And in the sense that a traditional way of decision making is sequential, right? You have a form, somebody signed it and sent to the next department, the next person signed it. But in the information age, it's synchronous, because everybody has access at the same time to the same piece of information. So you have to change that mindset and thinking about how can I redesign the whole process so that the data, you can make more use of the data.
Okay, Troy, any thoughts?
A big pitfall I usually see, actually there's two that I don't think we've covered yet, though I agree with Dr. Zai that everybody seems to think that it's magic, is that not knowing how to measure success, right? So anytime you're implementing any type of project, or you should kind of be like, what's my profitability coming out of this? There are some things we do that are not profitable for regulatory reasons, but generally as a business, you're looking for profitability. So what am I going to gain out of getting the answer to this question? How can I measure that so I can determine whether or not that process can be further improved upon? And then is it even worth me doing it? Because will I expend more trying to solve this versus just having somebody continue a manual process versus automating it? The other thing is that trying to measure everything. I know we're not talking about machine learning, but you can overcomplicate a model, to Dr. Sai's point, trying to include every potential variable you can think of, in which case the data at that point becomes so unwieldy that the decisions that you're trying to drive off of it are not going to be timely. You're not going to be able to act upon them in a timely manner, and that's just going to make the whole model worthless. So kind of identifying the drivers towards that greatly influence those behaviors of your customers or as a business, and identifying the returns off of that'll help you measure them more appropriately and get a better result from narrowing that data down to those specifics versus trying to include every possible point of data you have.
Okay, very good, very good. And before I go to my next question for the panel, I want to remind those that you're listening that you have an opportunity to add a question. So if you have a question, you'll notice at the very bottom to the right on your screen is a Q&A feature. So you can type in anonymously if you'd like. You don't have to identify yourself. A question for the panel, and we'll wrap up here in a few minutes with any final questions that we have from you. I want to go back to something that generally is not discussed in small business circles, but definitely discussed in larger organizations, and that's data governance, which I simply define as, for my own purposes, sort of setting the rules of the road of how we manage and organize data within an organization, sort of that structure. What implications does data governance have for a growing business? There are business owners that we have in the region that are multi-million-dollar businesses. They have somebody owns customer service data, CFO owns the financial services data. Any comments in terms of how data governance or how a small business owner should think about governing their data? And I'll start with, I don't know, whoever wants to take that one first.
I guess I'll start since I established a data governance council. So what you're kind of getting to there, David, is information silos, right? Because the CFO has all the financial data, customer service has all the CRM data, so to speak. So with the data governance council, what you're trying to do is, in many ways, make sure that everyone is aware of what data is available within the organization. For small businesses, that may not be something they have to worry about as much because per the polls, it may just be an Excel spreadsheet or 5 or 6 different Excel spreadsheets, right? But what you would want to consider as a business as you're growing is, how are we treating our data? Do we have rules in place where if you're getting this type of data, sales data or whatever, it is saved into this folder so that everybody knows where that data is stored at? A big thing I talk about at Hudson Valley is a shared data vocabulary. Because we have different departments, terminology used in one department may also be used in another department, but with completely different context. That is not as applicable for a lot of the other small businesses, but it is something to consider so that if you have people talking about data, that they're all using the same type of terminology and phrasing, because when people start to use different terminology that's close to being similar, you end up with there being a bit of a blur, right? And so people they kind of have an idea of what someone's talking about, but there's the possibility that what's being relayed may be misinterpreted, and that will lead to wrong decisions being done. So with data governance in small businesses, in my opinion, it's more along the lines of setting up guidelines for how data is used, where the data is stored at, and then specific terminology related to financials and reporting that is used within the reports so that everybody has a clear understanding of what the reports are relaying.
Okay. Mr. Clark, Dr. Sai, any?
Yeah, it's interesting what Troy said about the governance of data, and the key is obviously sharing the information. My background, I spent several years in sales, and one of the things that in a small business or a large business is the ability or the inability to capitalize on information that's just sitting there. For example, in a sales field, one of the keys is obviously sales leads, but you would be very surprised at the fact that sales leads are gathered, or whether it's an incoming or outgoing system that's set up, there's a substantial number of sales leads that are not acted on. And so one of the things that Troy suggested, you need to set up a policy or procedure that says, we have to, within X number of days, follow up on that sales lead or that customer inquiry. I can't emphasize that enough, because the governance of that information has to be shared with everyone, but the policies and procedures have to be in place to make sure that you follow through. And I know that that's a real challenge in any sales force, and has to be acted on.
Yeah, that's great. I think all of us, I know I have experienced it. I go to a website to check out a local business, and it says, send me your information, and I don't get anything back. Yeah. Like, I never hear from anybody. Nobody calls me or emails me. I'm like, so why'd you set up the functionality to collect the data? So you captured me, but you didn't actually want to talk to me anyway. Yeah. Well, it's amazing. It happens in large and small organizations. I've seen it up and down. It's almost puzzling, I think. That's a great point. Dr. Sai?
I think Troy and Ted mentioned this more about integrity side, but I think these days security is also very important. So from an internal control point of view, just you need to set up some like policies, procedures. So in 3 steps, easily first set up policy, procedures, and then communicate those policy procedures with employees. And then the 3rd step is monitoring the process, see whether there's any violation of those policy or procedures or not, and keep educating your employees. And there are a lot of cases that people, for example, like simple things like sharing passwords And there are cases like, for example, a lot of teaching hospitals, of course, they have people working in the hospital, also working for the universities. And somebody can get in not only getting the college employees information, they can also get the medical data from the same database. So these are the things that is becoming more and more important. So those are, I think, the internal control process of policy procedures, and then communication, then monitoring of the 3 steps to follow.
Okay, very good. And a follow-on to that, cloud computing, obviously, I mean, all of us know that it's a huge business, growing all the time. AWS, everybody's in it, Microsoft's in it. And small business owners have an opportunity at a very low cost to store a lot of their data. Any comments and thoughts on the advantages and disadvantage of storing your data as a small business owner on the cloud versus keeping it, on your hard drive or on a server somewhere in your business? Any thoughts at all, anyone?
I use, for example, just a very simple basis. We use a Microsoft system in the college, so we have OneDrive. And not to talk, even if you keep your data on Excel, these days you can set up a local desktop connected with OneDrive. So wherever you go, you travel overseas, as long as you have access to the cloud service, it's very convenient. You have data stored at one site, and then you can access many different places. You also have a local copy in case you don't have internet connection. You can have that. If you work on the cloud, it's saved automatically. You don't need to worry about losing power, that lost everything. So from a small business point of view, that is a very, very easy way to do it. And also they usually give you a free space at the beginner. So try that first.
Okay, good. Any other points on that?
Yeah, I think sharing information, as Chiang said, is probably one of the key advantages of using the cloud, because you can work on a project 3 or 4 people remotely because you all have access to the same data. I found that repeatedly. That worked in trying to do an analysis of information or data, which everybody can see what you're doing, and then make or create or provide input to whatever's been posted to the cloud. So yeah, great for working remotely.
Okay. The last thing I want to touch on, and this is, and we'll go right to questions, is something we didn't talk about earlier, is that most business owners aren't familiar with the fact that most of their data is structured data. And a lot of data that they have access to today is unstructured data. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about the differences between structured data and unstructured data, and what's happening, photos and data that is in the unstructured category, which I'll let one of you define. What's happening in terms of marrying the two together, and how important is it? I don't know who wants to take that one first. Dr. Sai, perhaps?
I guess most of small business probably you start with a structural data, and of course we talk about images, or for example text. There's a different level of knowledge that required to process the data. Although in the software side, it's becoming more and more powerful. You can do that. If you are processing those unstructured data, I don't think that most of us have the resources to do that. Use the cloud service. Just give you an example. If you go to post in terms of images, post a picture to Microsoft Azure, it will tell you what the mood of the people in the picture. And so that's the next step. But I think small business should start working from structural data. And then if you do need that, that's the next step. And maybe use available services, or think about how you can slowly develop skills into that area. But I would say probably in the first step, just not touching that data as your first endeavor into the analytics area.
Right, which is understandable. And I was going sort of in the line of, there's a lot of social media context. People post information, they leave reviews. So there's a lot of contextual data that's available to small business owners, because many of them are much more savvier nowadays in terms of trying to get that data or get people to give them that kind of contextual data.
There is, in fact, for example, if you go to those things that usually require more like computing resources. For example, I think again, those services have those, you can analyze text to see whether the customer like it or not, like 5-star system. There are a lot of examples, but there are always resources that you can utilize instead of develop in-house.
Okay. Anyone else?
I agree with Dr. Sai. I think if you're a small business, start out with structured data. Unstructured data is going to be much more difficult for you, even with text. If you are doing survey results, more than likely what you're going to be looking for is like a likelihood to recommend or overall satisfaction to help drive interpretation of the data. Looking at interpreting or taking the unstructured data of their comments in order to drive kind of results out of that, I don't think as a small business, you would have the resources internally to do that. You would have to look for external sources to do that for you. And I don't know if necessarily you would gain as much of a benefit of that as instead relying more on the structured data of like the ratings from those key questions that you're looking for.
Right. Okay. Very good. Mr. Clark, any other
Yeah,
comments?
I was just thinking about it in a traditional questionnaire where you have both structured and unstructured questions. One of the problems that comes up in the unstructured ones, as Troy just suggested, is how do you really analyze that data so that it can be useful to you? The structured ones are generally fairly clear and straightforward, whereas the unstructured are definitely open to interpretation. And so now if you're talking about interpretation, the perception of one person might be different in terms of, this is what I understand the theme of these unstructured responses are. And someone else says, no, I see it a different way. So you're right. Structure, I think, is the initial approach for small businesses.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, because there's a lot of hype out there, a lot of marketing going on in terms of what machine learning or AI programs can or cannot do. And so I think, business owners are going to see a lot of that out there, a lot of chatter. And so the advice of the team then is basically focus on your structured data, the data that is tangible data that lives in your financial systems, your HR systems, your customer systems, your inventory systems, et cetera, which is you can relate to. I'm going to switch here a little bit as we're running up to 1 o'clock. We don't have any questions from anyone that's currently listening. So we did have a couple of pre-submitted questions, mind you. And I'm just going to read this here. So as it is, it says, for a very small business with limited access to cash or credit, what is the best way to grow my business while paying down debt that I accrued while trying to survive COVID? So that's a big one. There's a mouthful right there.
So I can just say, do some planning. I mean, I don't know exactly your business area is, but even as I mentioned that using an Excel, you can do a small projection of future sales, future expenses. You have a plan. I think for small business, probably marketing and cash flows. That's two major things, right? So I don't know much about marketing, but just say plan your cash flows. And using, for example, your mortgage payment, lay out a maybe 24 months plan, have a worst case scenario, and thinking about that and see if that happened, how can I survive that? And if you can survive that, most likely you are not going to hit that worst case scenario. So you are going to do better. But always a plan, you can always, and a goal that is kind of reachable, measurable, and do adjustment from time to time and see whether you're heading to the direction, or maybe the direction you set originally was not quite right, and do some adjustment. But always, I think these days with this tough environment, always has a backup plan, just and think about the worst case scenario.
Okay, very good. Mr. Clark?
When it comes to that kind of scenario, marketing, all of a sudden you realize how important it is. For one thing, what you would want to do is, first of all, you have to be flexible. You can't continue, for example, if you're a restaurant, to follow the same process you did in the past. Instead of the customers coming to you, you literally have to go to them. So, there's an immediate change in the operation for an organization. But when we talk about, perhaps reaching out to a new market, it's essential. If you're a restaurant, you know that there are certain groups of customers who might be particularly receptive to the idea of having food delivered to them versus they're coming to your restaurant. But I think it's also a part of marketing to create an image. If you want to ensure that you increase revenue, you have to make people comfortable with the idea of coming to your restaurant. So what are the things you have to do? You have to assure them that they're going to be safe, and that you have a safe environment in your restaurant by indicating and showing that your staff wears masks, and that you sanitize everything all the time, that you don't have a salt and pepper shaker, for example, on tables anymore. What you do is give people packets of salt and pepper. I mean, these are small things, but in terms of changing the operation to make people feel comfortable based on the image that you're projecting, I think that that's a key thing. So flexibility and changing your operations would be key.
Some great advice there. Excellent. Thank you. And then Troy?
I mean, I don't know what the business is, to Dr. Tsai's point. And with my background, I would fall on looking at financial records, like he said, looking at projections going forward, doing some type of analysis on where have we seen sales drop, or, is it specific to a demographic or product type? And then kind of to Ted's point, looking at the marketing for that. Is there some way we can adjust that going forward to increase sales or change the product delivery so that we don't have much of a lost income? But I know those are kind of vague and ambiguous, but really look at your profitability, look at your marketing, and try and leverage those two together to get the results you want.
Okay. Well, that's going to conclude our webinar, and our first here at Hudson Valley, delving into data analytics and how it applies to small businesses. I want to take a moment here to thank our panelists who took time out of their busy days, midday, to join us for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm really excited. There's a lot of great information here. I want to thank each and every one of you for providing that for our members, and for anybody out there that's struggling to build a business that they want to thrive and be successful in the long run. We could have spent a whole lot more on data analytics, and maybe we'll come back to this another time. But I want to thank all of you who have joined us today. Remember that we're going to be sending out a copy of the link to this webinar so that you'll be able to view it again if you missed parts of it. And of course, hopefully we'll hear from you again. Thank you all. Have a great day, and we'll see you again.